All right. Well, Tim, it's great to see you again, my friend.
Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah,
Busy
this is a
times.
long this is a long time overdue. We've been meaning to do this for a while. It's just hard to coordinate our schedules, but as promised, we are going to do some critiquing of some of the entries from NLPA year 2. And what we thought we would do is pick out kind of a random selection of people who agreed to have their images critiqued for people who did not advance past the pre-screening phase.
Yeah.
Which is it's pretty cool. We've got about 11 people's images pulled up.
So yeah, we've got the star rating, and I think at the star rating there we had anything with a 4 stars and over was considered for going through to the next phase, or approximately that. So that'll give it an idea of how close people got in that first round of scoring.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just go through this individual's images. This is Anne Petrukovic. Sorry if I butchered your name there, Anne. And we're just going to go through each one of these and react to them as if we were prejudging the images. Tim, if you want to go first on this one, that's cool.
Yeah, and I was looking through the whole set at the moment, and for me, this one was the one that stood out the most in terms of interest, because it intrigued me as what's happening. It's got some interesting textures, nice color in there. So out of the lot, I think the other one that possibly intrigued me was the black and white one with the ferns. But what I like about this one is mainly that it makes you think to begin with what I'm seeing. There are some nice shapes, but there's also a little weakness as far as I'm concerned about the corners, how they resolve. So there's a very open left corner on it, and you can start to look at these things very analytically, but it's about what draws your attention and what doesn't draw your attention. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think for me, the things that kind of niggled at me in terms of not scoring it higher was the way that this bright area on the right upper corner kind of pulls your eye off the frame. And I agree with you, this kind of empty space in the upper left doesn't really add much to the image. It would have been nice to have, you have this nice feature down here. It'd be nice if you had something similar up here just to add a little bit of balance to the image.
That's a very general rule about photography, is that the closure of the frame, it doesn't always, not always important, but it's quite nice, especially in detail shots, is to have some way of closing the edges.
Yeah. Otherwise your eye tends to drift towards those spaces instead of the areas that the photographer probably wants you to focus on. I don't know, some of these out of focus areas were kind of weird to me. Like the coloration of them was kind of strange.
The blue one there was the one that drew my eye as a distraction. I agree.
Yeah, that stuff right there. But otherwise, it is an interesting image. So
and a nice idea.
Yeah, moving on to this one, looks like a detailed shot on the coast with some interesting rocks and maybe some, I don't know, I'm not a marine biologist, so I'm not totally sure what those things are.
Yeah, this one's an interesting one. It's very hard to make these sorts of shots work when you've got the dry rock on the seaside, because they picks up so much. You get algal growths and such like on things, and these images to work have got to be about the shapes. And what we've got an image that's very bright in the center and left and dark on the right hand side. There's a bit of interest on the right hand side with the limpets, and the foreground is a little bit messy. So I think generally this is an idea that might work, but they are very difficult to make work, I think, with these.
Yeah, and I think for me, what kind of threw me off was that you have this really interesting shapes and patterns, but then you've included these 4 seashell things, which create visual interest. I mean, you could almost argue that they're the hero of the photograph, but they're not in focus.
They've got to be a feature if they're going to be in there, and as a feature, they're out of focus and in the wrong part of the frame, possibly. So
right. So you could easily solve that problem by doing some focus stacking, which we do allow in our competition. And otherwise, I think the image did okay. I think, you could even argue that if you would have flipped it horizontal to the left or something like that, that could have been interesting. So yeah, but I liked it. I think we scored it a 2 overall, which means it's a okay photo. Let's move on to this one.
I'll let you go first.
Okay. I have a very strong preference personally for black and white photography that has a little bit more contrast than this. I don't necessarily really like seeing a lot of gray tones, and the whites aren't necessarily very white, and the blacks are okay, but I would have liked to have seen a little bit more contrast in this image or a little bit more tonal range. That's my personal preference. And I didn't necessarily find the subject to be that interesting.
No, I've tried taking pictures of things like this before, and again, it's very difficult because you want to drop the background out of focus, but to drop the background out of focus on something that close means that you're going to end up with bits of the branch in focus, which you can see in the bottom right-hand side that we're losing focus on parts of it, and also the background at the edges of the branch going out of focus a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
One of the issues is, in many ways here, is the way that the branch comes in on the left-hand side and goes out to the bottom, like it's the corner of a pipe in the house or whatever, which leaves a very weak top right-hand side of the picture.
Right.
So structurally, it would be with a lot of things like this, it's better to try and get a top left to bottom right diagonal of some sort. You can do it straight across, but then it's quite flat and boring. Same with the vertical. So the ones that I've seen work have been typically done on a strong angle and more of a linear feature. But right. you are relying on trying to get everything in focus. And like you say, focus stacking in this will work a lot better. And I agree with the tonality for a black and white. It's quite difficult. Yeah,
and I was curious what you thought about in terms of Western culture versus Eastern culture preferences for how we read an image. It's similar to how we read a book. So if this were to be flipped, like you were suggesting, going from bottom left to upper right, I wonder if it would have been stronger. But then I also wonder if we were from an Eastern culture, would we prefer this orientation?
Yeah. I have thought about this before and looked at images and read a little bit about it, and it's pretty inconclusive whether it makes a big difference.
Oh, okay.
I think you can force a way of reading a picture, which is probably the best way of doing it, by having the focus point on one side or the other. So whether the highlights are there or.
Yeah, I guess, flipping it like this, it doesn't. Oh, it changes it a little bit. I actually kind of like that a little bit more myself.
It does. I mean, for me, that reads better. But I think it's the way the composition. I would probably crop that slightly if I was going to do something with it to try and concentrate more on the areas with the sort of crinkled edges.
Yeah, bring in some of that stuff from the upper right down a little bit so that it's not occupying so much visual weight.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so concentrate the frame more on the actual textures of the picture, and maybe have less of the mossy bits on the right that are currently on the right hand side in there. But it's trying to decide what the picture is of. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Is the picture of the crinkly bits, or is it of the mossy bits? And if whatever it's of, try and make that the feature of a picture.
Yep. All right, let's move on to this one.
I really like this one.
I do too. I think it's got a really interesting idea. It's got a nice shape. I think there's some really interesting visual elements going on here. I like the way the sword ferns are kind of pointing down into this empty space. I guess it would have been nice if there was something of more visual interest here in the center.
That was my problem with it. That fern that's dangling down in the middle is the key feature. That's the focus of it, and it doesn't really have enough in itself to keep attention and keep me looking, because the rest of it's closed beautifully. The way you've got this surround, it's just there's nothing in the center. It's like you've taken a great picture and removed the middle of it out.
Yeah, I think it's got a lot of potential. I think if it was a little bit maybe sharper, or if there was something else there that held your attention, I think that could work better. But what's cool about
one fern leaf right in the middle of it's just hanging there, perfectly framed.
Yeah, I know. I think the photographer obviously saw something special here. I would be curious if they have other versions of this that might show that off a little bit more. But
it shows a lot of good skill in framing. I will say that.
Yep. Moving on to this one.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I see a lot of kind of reflected water photographs, and I like to make them myself. I find them to be very challenging. And in this particular instance, I guess what I like about it is that there is an interesting color story between the blues and the yellows. You've got that nice, warm, cool kind of combination. But I feel like some of the coloration is a little bit muddy, and I don't necessarily feel like anything is necessarily in focus, which is not always a problem. But for me, it's like neither the ripples nor the reflection are focused in. So it's hard for me to
most of the pictures I've seen where this works is there has been a clear distinction between is it of the ripples or is it of what's in the background?
Right.
And in this case, I think they overlap too much.
Yep, I think that's
and the
right.
green coloration is a bit odd, bit sickly yellows rather than a nice yellow.
Yeah, especially, oops, especially this section over here. Yeah, it's upper left. Okay, and then the last one is this one, which is very simple. I actually really enjoy these types of images. I think this one's pretty well executed. I like the gradation of colors. Again, I wonder if it was from left to right instead of right to left, if that would change my opinion of it. I think one of the challenges that this particular photographer suffers from is that we saw a lot of photos like this submitted to NLPA this year, that in order for something like this to stand out, there's got to be something a little bit extra for it to be elevated beyond like a average score.
I think we also had because we're looking at the photography in terms of it being a representation of something, we have to know that there's something in the background. In this case, it's very hard to know what this is of. So it's used the ICM to create a textural picture, which doesn't have a subject. And I think that doesn't really fit in with what we're doing with an NLPA, which is trying to have a truthful image of nature that's been interpreted. So when we've had sort of ICM pictures, the ones that have done well have been the ones where you can still see what it's of, but the ICM has been used in a way to creatively enhance it or change the interpretation of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's spot on. Okay, let's move on to Brandon Hurt, who there's a ton of images in here. So
I think he's got probably a couple of projects in there.
Yeah, I'm going to get rid of these project things, and we probably don't have to go through every single one of these, but actually let's look back at the whole collection here. Is there one of these that stands out more for you? There's a lot. Actually, there's a couple of duplicates too because of projects.
The textural snow ones, I would say, probably with the trees.
Yeah.
One of the waterfall ones, and maybe a couple of the waterfall ones, and maybe the tree ones at the top middle. That's the sort of ones that are standing out as I'm looking at it from a distance.
Yeah. Let me do this real quick.
Can we get the projects out at all from that one, or is it just?
No, I can't.
I'll tell you what. If you get the names of them.
Yeah. So, for me, I agree with you. I think some of these snow images are definitely standouts. I actually really like this black and white tree image. I think if I were to say something kind of overall, that's kind of a challenge for Brandon here, is that he's got a lot of good photos, but none of them were like above and beyond what we saw as being kind of like the standard of being good or okay. For example, you have this photo here. I think it's well composed. You've got nice colors. You got a nice clouds. You even got a little bit of fog going on down here. We have lots of similar photos like this that were entered. So it's, how do you differentiate between what's good and what's average? Maybe you would want to speak to that a little bit, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, composition wise, I look at that and I'm trying to, if we think the foreground of that picture that you had up was key to how you read it, what we've got is a foreground that's all the berries and with a stone that's off to one side. And it's difficult to say, okay, well, how has that been arranged? It's beautiful textures, beautiful trees, great sky, but it's not structured. And I think that's probably the weakness in the image there. I would be looking at the patterns in this, I'm not actually sure what it was, some berries of some sort.
I think it's fall foliage.
Fall foliage. I'd be trying to find an area where I can get close to something and bring some texture into it and some shape. I think the thing that's missing here is the construction of shape and composition in the picture. And it's the way I also then decide, okay, where the background is. We look across the middle. We've got two trees that are leaning over on the left-hand side, which are really drawing attention. But they're a distraction in my eyes for the rest of it. But they're not balanced by anything on the right-hand side of the frame. So we don't have a balanced view there. Whereas in the center, if you look in the middle of the picture, you've got one tall tree with two maybe 2 trees left and right of them that are shorter. It gives an idea. So that tree at the convergence of the clouds could become the focus of the picture. So move right a bit, get in front of that stone, place the stone in front of that tree in the background, and you start to use the sky to be part of the picture. So that's the sort of attention that you'd want to see. Even that, using it as a crop. You've drawn attention to that big tree. Now that big tree has become the feature of the picture. It's the clouds are enhancing it, and we've got opposite it in the frame, we've got the rock with the textures. So that becomes a stronger picture in like that. But thinking about that when you're on location, thinking about how can I make this sky work with the horizon? How can I make the horizon work with the foreground? It's
hard. I feel like that's one of the challenges that grand scenic photography has, is that you have such a wide view, and it becomes, the more you include in your frame, the harder it becomes then to compose, because you have so many competing elements for your attention. And I think that's why we see, there's been a trend of people saying, oh, we don't see a lot of grand scenic photos winning in NLPA. And it's because I think to do a really well executed grand scenic image that is well composed, I think it takes a little bit extra technique.
Yeah. And when you're shooting wide, to recompose, you've got to move a mile. Whereas if you're shooting intimate, recompose, you can move 2 feet to the right.
That's right. What do you think of this black and white?
It's a bit slow coming up on my screen at the moment, so apologies for reacting a little slowly.
I can kind of give my thoughts on it.
Yeah, go on, then you start.
Yeah, so I like the central focus of the image with this rock feature in the middle. And then you have all this bright, empty sky above it, which doesn't necessarily bother me per se. I think what captured kind of my attention in terms of judging it is that you have all of these features in the corners that are helping to tell the story of the location, but everything's out of focus. And that kind of bothered me for whatever reason. And I think there's probably a little bit too much sky for this image to do well in my mind. I feel like if you have too much sky like that, it doesn't really add anything to the story or to the picture for me.
Yeah. Unless it's working with the rest of the picture, I would agree.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the biggest thing there for me is the out of focus. Second to that is the amount of out of focus. The amount of detail in those isn't adding much to the picture, because the picture for me is about that stone column and the way that the trees are surrounding it and the mist in the background.
Right.
So these edges don't add much to it. So get closer. That's always is that the usual thing to say in composition?
Right. I mean, what's interesting about this composition is I actually think it works pretty well. You have these diagonal lines coming up from the left. You have a line coming up this way from the right and center on this foreground rock. And then on this rock on the right, you have the same thing. It's all pointing to your main subject. Problem is, all of those features are out of focus, and it doesn't really help tell the story in my mind.
If I was there taking that picture, I would probably just crop in, change the lens from a 50 to an 80 or whatever it is, or 24 to a 30, and crop from the top and the left edge, definitely, and maybe a bit from the right edge.
Yeah, even something like this, it's already more interesting for me.
Yep.
All right. Let's look at a couple of these snow images. I feel like we saw quite a few kind of these really ethereal, out of focus snow images. I think, me personally, I really love these types of photos. What made this photo not stand out for me was that beyond the out of focus snow, there wasn't really any other subject. I can tell that there's like a tree back there, but there's a big part of me that wants to see more of that tree. I want to know what's interesting about that tree. Is there interesting branches of that tree? Is there moss hanging off the branches? Like, is there a couple of leaves in there? I just would have liked to have seen a little bit more than just the snow. I feel like a photo like this,
what we've got is the start of a good idea and the start of a good picture. I mean, can we move to image number 14? Is it on there? Maybe.
Yeah.
It might take a while to pop up on my screen.
Which this also almost looks like the same exact scene.
Yeah. but from what I can tell of this, it's not popped up big on my screen yet. But you've started to bring the background in as well, and you started to have some color variation in the view.
Right. Yeah, and you can actually make out some of the branches and things like that. I think one of the other things that for me, what doesn't work here is some of the muddy kind of blotchy coloration that's going on. And I don't know if that's was intentional or if that's just a product of the snow, but I feel like, I don't know, there could have been a little bit cleaner color work here for me.
It's an issue when you're focusing on the trees in the background. You've got the apertures not very large, then all the snowflakes that are going straight past the front of the camera are out of focus and blotchy. So it's a matter of the balance between the two, and possibly the framing on here is if we look at the picture on the top right hand side where the snow's landed in all those branches, you've got very white branches on that area very top right. There's a bit of a distraction. And I think the interesting idea here is those two trees in the middle with the textures. So it may have been worth waiting until the snow was a bit less, or try taking pictures, multiple pictures, some with lots of snow, some with not much snow, and see how they work between them at some point in the middle.
Or play with your aperture a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, stop down a bit.
But it's an interesting idea. That definitely engages more than the previous one with just the snow on itself.
Yeah, I agree. Here's a ICM image that Brandon submitted. And for me, I guess a few things. I feel like these kind of ICM images like this are very, like, how do I say this? It's fairly cliche. It's kind of been done a lot. As soon as I see an image like this, I know how it was created. I know it, I don't know, like for an ICM image like this, it needs to have something more going on in terms of an interesting subject that's in addition to the trees. And I think the other thing is like there's some technical weaknesses up here. You can see there's probably a dust spot on the sensor that didn't get cleaned on there, and then the upper left-hand corner, same thing. Other than that, it's an interesting image, but if you're going to do ICM, it's got to be pretty exceptional to make it past the first stage.
The thing you've got to think about, I think, when in terms of a competition like this, is all the judges see a lot of pictures, and they've seen pictures like this done and that have won competitions in the past. So they've seen some exceptionally good examples. And so it's down to like, what are you bringing to it that's new? How are you going to wake these judges up a bit and go, oh, well, I've seen stuff like this before done exceptionally well, but this is different. And that's what needs to be in the back of your head.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic feedback. Maybe let's look at this tree image with the park bench. For me, right away, there's some issues with this photo that could have been relatively easily solved. With our rules, you couldn't have cloned out whatever this thing is. I think it might be a sign or a post or something, but you could have cropped in a little from the upper left, or I'm sorry, the upper right, to deal with this kind of rogue branch that's sticking out and whatever this fence thing is, and maybe even that small bit of tree up there. And just a simple crop like that already makes it a much stronger image that doesn't have your eye kind of leaving the frame to examine kind of what's on the edges.
I think generally having clean edges on a picture is something that a lot of the judges will definitely say that's a necessity. It's the way things compose. So anything that's distracting around the edge of a picture is very distracting.
Yeah.
So, but the actual idea is quite nice in the central area of that.
It's a beautiful tree. I love the snow, and you can just feel the cold wind blowing right through your skin. Yes. So it's a good idea. It's a good image. Let's look at a couple more. This is another ICM. It looks like with some really interesting colors. I'm sure this was a pretty amazing scene to witness. But again, I think back to your point about ICM, there's got to be something else going on that makes the judges stop and go, oh, because for me, when I see this, I already know probably that you had your camera set up and you did like a 3 or 5 second exposure and you just panned to the left on your ball head or whatever. So it's not that different for me.
Yeah. I mean, we had we have a long exposure? It wasn't ICM. There was a picture of a black pool where the moon had drawn a shape.
Right.
In the bottom. It ended up in the book.
Yep.
And it's not ICM, but it's something that surprised the judges. They were like, "Oh, that's interesting. How was that done?" I'm like, what is that of?
Yep.
Beautiful shapes and the frame is closed, etc. But it's drawing the interest of the judges because they see so many pictures. It doesn't have to necessarily be different in terms of subject or treatment, but it's got to have something to make them go, "That's interesting."
Yep, I agree. Let's move on to this waterfall as kind of the last one. I think he had 3 or 4 images that scored an average score of 3, which is really good for us.
Yeah.
And
Borderline
this is
getting through to the next round, yeah.
And this is one of them. I think, first of all, I will just say this, like waterfall images there's a lot of waterfall images out there. People have seen waterfall photos over and over and over again. So in order for a waterfall image to do well in a competition, there's got to be something more going on, whether it be something, I don't even know, like maybe there's really intense light, or maybe there's something really fascinating in the foreground that we've never seen before.
Or just a really good composition. I mean, that's
Yes.
what we read, isn't it? It's
and I think
something that's
this
one really well seen.
Yeah, and I think this one compositionally is probably where it might be weakest, for me anyway. It has decent flow from bottom to top or top to bottom, but it does get blocked up a little here in the upper right. And then there's some visual elements that kind of, how do I say this? They kind of stop you in your tracks a little bit and prevent your eye from continuing to flow, like this stick that's sticking out, which again, with our competition rules, you can't get rid of the stick, but
lean over and pick
maybe
it up.
you could, or you could just recompose a little bit, maybe move to your left or something like that, or move up a little to exclude it. Because I think that's a really interesting waterfall, and I love the green mosses. But you got this rock over here on the left that doesn't really do much for me. This stuff down here at the bottom is kind of, I don't know, it just doesn't feel like it's carefully arranged.
That foreground was the biggest distraction for me.
Yeah.
I thought that the composition of the boulders that come from the top left and sort of like flow downwards towards the camera were really good. I thought that's one of the most interesting ideas in it.
Right. Again, look at this crop you could do. Very simple, but something like this could completely change your image, or even a little bit more. Get rid of that little stick. It's still a nice waterfall. You have this beautiful flow of mossy rocks, and you have the central subject that draws your attention. And then there's nothing else competing for the viewer's eye. Yeah.
That might have been just enough to get it to the next round.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, we've covered a bunch of Brandons. Let's move on to Christian. So Christian, let's see here. We've got quite a few images. I think the best score they got was a 2 on a few of them, and they got a few 1s. I guess we can just kind of start at the top here and move through them.
My screen's still refreshing at the moment. It's been quite slow.
No worries. So for this one, there's 4 leaves kind of arranged in a circle, and then in the very center, there's like a little seedling coming up through the rock or whatever. I think it's an interesting idea. I think for me, it felt too arranged, like it was too unnatural, like it was like almost like the leaves were placed, which I personally have nothing against placing leaves, but if you're going to do it, maybe try not to be too obvious about how it's done. Maybe they weren't placed. I don't know.
It's hard to actually place things and make them look natural. It's really hard. I mean, I'm not sure whether these were exactly placed, but
I don't know.
For me, it's the idea is perhaps a little bit contrived in terms of the way it looks, a little bit obvious, and the frame doesn't appear closed. The right hand leaf's clipped slightly on the frame. The top leaf is obviously clipped a lot.
It would have been nice to have some breathing room.
I like that the photographer's got this idea though, and tried to do something different with this. I love the idea of the little plant in the hole, the floor-leaved sapling, whatever it is.
And what was nice about it is you have the 4 little leaves down there, and then you have the 4 leaves around.
Exactly.
So I think it's a nice idea, but I do feel like it's a little too forced, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It can end up being too geometric and not feeling natural, possibly.
Right.
And the leaves are quite tatty. They've seen better days, perhaps, as well.
Yeah, that doesn't usually bother me.
No,
I
it probably
agree with you
wouldn't
though.
if the composition worked with it all. Yeah.
I would have liked to see a little bit more breathing room though in the frame,
Yeah.
just to give those leaves a little bit something to kind of keep your attention from falling off the frame to the right and to the top. Like this breathing room of the bottom left leaf is perfect.
Yeah, that's the best one, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. All right, moving on to the next one. It appears to me like this is maybe like some sand or some rocks on a beach. I'm not totally quite sure. I think it works pretty well as an abstract image because you can't really tell what it is, which I think is kind of ideal. But for me, there wasn't really enough visual interest in terms of keeping me very interested in looking at the image for a long time. And I found my eye kind of gravitating towards parts of the image that maybe aren't very interesting, like this splotchy leaf thing down here, and then all of these black lines up here. For me, it's hard to describe, but just didn't do much for me. I'm curious what you
Yeah.
think.
There's two immediate things. There's not a lot of interesting structure. It's quite varied across the frame. And there's a few bits, like I'm not sure if it's a leaf sitting down the bottom. But also I think another issue is it's taken in direct sunlight. And so you've got a lot of specular reflections here and there, which can be quite distracting. So often I think these sort of photographs work better in a slightly overcast sky. So I would be saying, well, there's potential there with the black and the sand. I'd be looking for some more interesting shapes. So you can see actually in the where the water's running itself, it's more, the patterns are more clear. And also I'd be looking for an area like that without the specular distractions and without any detritus. So
Yeah, this is one of those
area.
this is one of those examples where composition is king, because you've got this bottom right hand corner, it kind of loses visual interest. There's not much going on down there. So you have like potentially like a full eighth of your photo that has zero visual interest. And then you've got this line up here in the upper right, that couple lines that kind of pull you out, which could have been cropped out. And then this brighter area in the upper left, which is somewhat of a distraction. So I feel like maybe a different composition could have helped as well.
These are, again, the challenging places to go, because if you're on a beach, a lot of photographers like to go to beaches, take pictures.
Love it.
When they go there, they have a lot of time to wander up and down a beach, on every beach in the world. So for something to do very well in this area, this type of photograph, it's got to be exceptionally good, because it's such a easily accessible place these beaches are, and there's a lot of interest on them. So as a subject, they're quite challenging to create something novel.
Exactly. Moving on. So this appears to be a mine, which that would have done really well conceptually in our environmental award that we have. I think for me, immediately when we're doing pre-screening, the first thing we're looking for is very obvious technical flaws in terms of editing or color, things like that. And for me, right away, this image just does not have good color balance in terms of the way it's edited. They've got these cyans in the clouds, which clouds should probably be white. My guess is they were using a circular polarizer, which I personally almost never use a circular polarizer anymore, because it just adds a lot of color cast, especially in the skies. And then the colors in the mining area down here just look like just oddly saturated. Like the colors there's just too much cyan and I don't know, like blues. Like it's just the color balance is way off for me.
I wonder if they've used the dehaze filter, which has the effect of increasing strange colors in ways that are very odd.
Yeah, and you've got these blocked off shadows and dark areas down here, which a modern sensor, that's pretty easy to recover that kind of stuff. My personal favorite tool in Lightroom is just to use the tone curve. And I like to just pull things over from the upper right-hand corner of the tone curve to the left until you're right at the edge of clipping. And that kind of rebalances the photo and usually can bring most of the shadows up to a pretty desirable location. You still have some clipping down here in the blacks, but Yeah, for me, the biggest thing was the colors, and then the composition. This foreground isn't very interesting. It's pretty messy. There's a
That's the
lot of,
biggest flaw for me, I think, is that patch of foreground. And if I look at the picture, the most interesting part of the picture for me is the road structure in front of the mine in the right hand
yep,
side, and the
yep.
trees just
Yes,
below and to the
these,
right of it.
yes.
And if you could
Yeah,
have placed those in front of the mine with the background, I think it would be a lot stronger picture.
right. If you could have moved to the right, maybe 300 or 400 feet, and use
Yeah, and
those
down a bit.
trees
Yeah,
as your foreground, and then you have a
exactly.
mine behind them, that could have been a really interesting
Yes.
contrast between
Yeah.
nature and man's impact. So I think they had the right idea, it's just not quite, didn't quite nail the execution. Next one. We've got looks like a kind of like a frozen, maybe wetlands area, and maybe like after a storm or during a storm. Again, for me, this one immediately kind of checked the box of having too many technical flaws. I mean, right away, if I look at the histogram up here for this image, you have clipped your blacks, a big chunk of them, and you've clipped a bunch of your whites as well in the snow and in the sky. So I'm not sure exactly what camera was used to capture this, but I personally like to expose to the right. I don't clip any highlights, and then I'll lift my shadows as needed. So that was the biggest technical flaw for me.
I'm still waiting for it to come up on my screen for some reason.
Oh,
It's just arrived. There we go. Yeah.
too
Yeah,
funny.
there's some interesting things going on in the picture. The reeds and the background to the right with the mountains are all very interesting.
Yep.
The curve of ice, the sweep of the ice
Yes.
in the foreground, it is interesting. Although it's
Yep.
because of the direct sunlight, it's gone very, very bright. But where it's placed with the frame, the piece of ice on the left-hand side is a bit of a distraction.
Right.
When the interesting thing is the curve.
Right.
So
Just
if you crop in from the
excluding
left on
that.
that, you might end up with a better picture. I don't know.
Yeah, something like that. There'd be less competition for your eye, I think,
Yeah.
and you create more of a curve up through the frame.
So
Yeah.
it's about removing distractions. If you look at the picture and you say, well, okay, what is it that's not working? What is the distraction? That piece of ice on the left was a visual attractor that wasn't contributing to the interesting parts of the picture. So try get rid of it, crop it out.
Yeah, and that bright area on the mountain for me is just, it just kills it.
Yeah.
I'm a big, I really, for me, blown highlights is like one of my, I'd rather see blocked shadows than blown highlights personally.
I've got my camera set on -1 exposure permanently to
Yeah.
ensure that I really never clip anything.
And it's so much easier to recover shadow data than highlight data.
Just the way digital sensors work. Although this may be a fact that it was taken on RAW, and it's just the settings that came out of the post processor, or it was JPEG in
Oh,
camera.
JPEG. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Moving on to the next one. We've got looks like another sandy beach image, maybe with some footprints or something like that in the sand. Again, I think interesting idea in terms of including different patterns and repeating patterns. I think that's the strength of this image. But again, I think the weaknesses are in the composition. You've included in the upper left-hand corner some very distracting elements. And then in the bottom with these circular patterns down here, those don't really add much for me. And I think there's some problems with the color balance here as well. It's a little too warm, actually.
I see it's yes, bird footprints in the sand. Yeah. Again, it's as an idea, if you're trying to make that idea work, you've got to look around for the footprints that are the cleanest. Try and get some structure in the way they're distributed. And I've got a funny feeling this was taken upside down. I don't know. It's got a very bright strip at the bottom of the picture,
Right.
which is it's brighter at the bottom, so it looks like there's lights shining from underneath.
Yep.
So I don't know whether the camera was upside down or they've taken it, but it's about structure. It doesn't have a particularly strong structure.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just a couple more here, moving on a little bit. This one got 2 stars. This is looks like pretty nice foliage scene. Again, not to harp on this too much more, but even though in the histogram it doesn't show any blown highlights, for me those highlights are pretty toast. So I would have probably cropped those out completely just to get rid of the bright distraction at the top of the frame. In general, I think it's smart to kind of do what I call border patrol and look for distracting elements on the edges and try to exclude those as best you can. I think this has some interesting color story. You've got the greens and the yellows and a little bit of blue down here. But again, I think this one suffers from when it was taken, probably in the middle of the day or early afternoon or late morning, and there's a lot of bright areas that are catching the reflection of the sun, especially in this rock down here and in the water. So you could have eliminated some of that with a circular polarizer. That's when a circular polarizer is actually useful. But in general, compositionally, I think this bottom left area doesn't really add much for you. There's not much visual interest, and it takes up a lot of real estate.
Could you do me a favor and just crop in about 15% from all sides? So basically zoom in.
Yeah.
About 8 mil. Because I think you're right about the highlights and on the edges. They're just a no-no. They get so distracted, and because they're blown out so much, you end up with strange fringing as well. And it's a general thing with woodland. When you get holes in the canopy that let the sun through, they're an attractor and a distraction. Whereas I think that there's some really interesting stuff going on in the background of this picture with the rock and the river and the tree coming out of the rock that could have been made more use of. So as you crop into it, that central area becomes a lot more interesting. You got rid of the distractions. You can get rid of some of the highlights and maybe some of the messy bits in the foreground, and the picture becomes a lot stronger for it.
Yeah, and compositionally, I think even if they would have just moved themselves physically forward 10 feet, it probably would have helped quite a bit. Because I do like the inclusion of I think this might be rhododendron or something, but this green plant is actually really nice. I like that. And I love the rocks. And actually, if you move closer, you could have gotten a little bit more of this rock on the right-hand side as well.
Yeah. And one final thing to say about that one as well is when you've got, there's a lot of variation in brightness around the frame there. It's quite often a good idea to darken the edges of the frame where they are brighter than the center of the frame. So in this case, we've got the bottom left-hand side and we've got the top edge that are both brighter than the subject that we want to show off. So in those cases, I would normally try and put a gradient filter across the top, put a gradient filter across the bottom left, perhaps, to try and bring attention back into the center, which is where we want.
Yeah, this is just a crude example of what you can do in Lightroom, but just a slight grad filter, and maybe not even using exposure, but maybe whites, pulling those down a little, maybe highlights, tad. But yeah, obviously a little more care. You can use different techniques, but that just kind of illustrates your point.
Broad, quick changes still make a big difference. Yeah.
Yep. All right, let's do one more for Christian here. Let's look at this guy here. This is looks like taken maybe on the coast. Got some green grasses popping up to the foreground. Looks like maybe there was like a lighthouse over there on the right-hand side. For me, this one suffers from a lot of technical issues. First one being the color balance just, again, feels weird. Like there's almost like a magenta color in the underside of the clouds, which doesn't work for me. And then you have the bright blown out highlights. Looking at my histogram here, there's definitely some blown out bits there in the sky. And I think for that foreground to work, you need to have maybe moved closer and gotten rid of this strip of kind of mowed down grass on the bottom left. Some of the same points that we saw before. Also looks like there might have been a dust bunny up here that could have gotten eliminated. So
I always find it a good idea, and I've done this in a couple of workshops before now, is say when people are taking pictures and they're working out what they want to take a picture of, take the picture you want, but also then zoom in a bit take another picture and maybe zoom out a bit and take another picture. In other words, try a few different crops and try a few different crops moving in and seeing how it works, because you'll learn what the crops make a difference in a picture. So you can go through the 4 or 5 pictures maybe you've taken at different zooms and work out for yourself which ones work and which ones don't, for what reason.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to play with the white balance here, using the white balance picker tool in Lightroom. I feel like some of these, this is probably a little too cool, but definitely feels like it suffers from some white balance problems too. All right. Well, hopefully that was helpful, Christian. We'll move on to Dennis. Let me just select all these and put them in a grid. So Dennis has some interesting selections here, and actually all of them scored a 2 as an average, which is pretty good. I think it'll be interesting for us to kind of critique each of these. For me, the most visually interesting 2 images were probably the top middle one and the bottom left one for me. Even though I do like the structure of the black and white, there's something about it. Maybe it'll come to me that I didn't like so much. But those are the 2 that stood out for me.
Yeah, I think so. I think the backlit aloe vera, I think it's an aloe vera, is quite nice. I really quite like the way that's working for interest. And the black and white's quite nice. It's just not quite there in terms of composition, but yeah, it's got some good variety of compositions and good variety of subject matter.
Yeah, so let's start with the plant. I like the idea of this photo quite a bit, with the backlit leaves. I think it could have been interesting to maybe get a little bit closer to zoom in on some of that more interesting parts, especially the upper the upper right hand side of it. I don't know, something like this. Like, I really like all the stuff that's going on in this part of the plant.
Exactly. Yeah. And the background color contrast is really quite nice as well, but you don't need to see quite as much of the background.
Right. You don't, like, this stuff over here on the left really doesn't add much. It's like just more of the same, only not as good.
Yeah.
And then you've got this little strip of bright area here on this one that just doesn't work for me. Let's see if I can use a brush and point it out. This here,
the hot spots. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's just it's catching direct sunlight, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So those are the things that I noticed for this one. But otherwise, I think it's a good idea.
Mostly, I think that's what's making me interested in that is because it's that color contrast between the foreground and background I really like. It's quite really interesting. And I've not seen backlit plants like this before, but the way the color contrast is working, from the blues of the actual surface of the shadows to the rich yellows and rich greens and then yellows on the bands or the edge of the leaves, really interesting. So I would maybe have moved around a little bit to try and place some of those high contrast edges against shadows in the background to try and make the contrast a bit better, and just zoom in a little bit slightly from the top and left and right edges. Make it a square. Everybody likes a square. Yeah.
I think a simple crop even really would have elevated this quite a bit.
All right. Yeah, good idea, and good try to do something with it. I like that.
Yeah, I think in general, one of the biggest mistakes I see photographers making, and trust me, I still make this mistake myself, is like, really think about what your subject is and try to emphasize it as much as you can, and get rid of the stuff that doesn't help emphasize what that is.
Yeah. It's a distillation process, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like making whiskey. All right, let's move on to this one.
Get rid of the fermenting mash. Let's have the alcohol.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this one I thought was really interesting. I actually love the color gradation and subject gradation from top to bottom, bottom to top. I like that it's green, and then it's kind of almost like this teal white color, and then there's a little bit of warm bits in the bottom. I think for me, I'm usually not a huge fan of out of focus bits like this. I don't necessarily think they add anything in terms of having them in the foreground unless there's a lot more of it. Because now what you have is you have all of these out of focus vertical lines that pull your eye down out of the frame instead of helping to contribute to what your subject is, which is all this awesome grass and foliage above it. So for me, I would have maybe chosen a different aperture, or I would have gotten a little bit closer to exclude those grasses, or I would have backed up and included a little bit more of those grasses so that they had a little bit more structure to them.
Or train one of your children to go into the foreground, just hold all the grass down.
Come on.
That would do the job. You might need multiple children for this. I don't know. I have cats. It wouldn't work with cats.
No, it wouldn't work with cats. Would you agree with me though, Tim?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think there's potential there definitely with the, like you say, the green at the top, the almost like fruiting plants, the red, yellow, and green in the bottom, and then that band of white. I think there's definitely some interest in there, and it's just killed by those grasses in the foreground for me.
Same. Okay. Well, good. We agree. Sorry, Dennis. Moving on to the next one. We've got, it looks like this was probably taken like in golden hour, just some maybe pine needles or something like that on the ground amongst the roots of a tree. For me, I like the idea of what Dennis was trying to accomplish with this in terms of the contrast between the roots and the pine needles and the nice color cast created by the setting sun or the rising sun or whichever it was. But I just feel like there wasn't enough differentiation between the roots and the pine needles, like maybe in terms of color balance or something. But and maybe the composition for me, there just wasn't enough visually interesting things that kind of worked its way through the frame to keep it interesting. And just
we've got a structure issue again with the picture in terms of what's the interesting bits and what's not. So where on the left hand side there's two smaller roots underneath with some dirt and stones in the background, and there's not many of the pine needles there, so it doesn't add to that feeling of the contrast between pine needles and roots. Whereas on the right hand side we've got these crisscrossing larger roots with lots of pine needles around and lots of interesting colors. In fact, we got zigzags from the very top right going all the way down. So I think if we just had a look to the right hand half of that frame, you'd see the sorts of things that I would be looking for if I was seeing a picture of that area. So you got less of the messy bits of soil and more of the needles and large roots.
Yeah, and if you step back and look at this photo, your eye immediately goes to, of course, it doesn't do what I want it to do but your eye immediately goes to this stuff, right?
Yes.
All
correct.
of like that's like the least interesting part of the photograph, so I think that's exactly right.
And I think on the right hand side, you've got this nice stepping down diagonals through the frame with lots and lots of pine needles catching that really nice warm light.
Yes.
So I'd want to see more of the right hand side part of the frame and less of the left hand side part of the frame. One of the things to note on this as well is the density of those shadows. Because you're in direct sunlight, the shadows are very, very dark, and they will draw the eye when you've got contrast like that. So you've only got a few choices. You can raise the shadows in post-processing to make them less obtrusive. You can move around so that you're more directly in line with the sun, so the shadows are hidden slightly. Or you can wait for a cloud to go over the sun slightly to soften those edges.
Yeah, and I think he actually had a really nice idea here.
Yeah,
because the more I look at it, you've got these triangular lines that are created by his composition.
Really nice.
Like this.
Yeah.
Multiple diagonal lines. And then, but what the problem was, like, imagine if this area here had more visual interest, or just all covered with pine needles. Yeah. And then there was something really interesting here in the center.
Yeah.
That could have worked incredibly well.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, now how do I get rid of all that crap I just drew?
Mash that Command Z button.
Love it. Okay. All right. Moving on. Let's turn this off. There we go. And we'll go to this image, which I thought personally this was the strongest image of the bunch for Dennis. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on here, and I think it's pretty well executed. I love the edge light on the foliage. I love this little tree over here on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
The biggest problem with this particular image for me is all of this empty space up here that doesn't add anything to the viewer.
Yeah. My other one there is that the two trees, the left-hand tree looks like it's trying to escape from the edge of the frame. Looks like it's running away.
Right. Yeah, and you know the composition has your eye kind of running this way, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think works pretty well, but it would have been interesting if that tree had a little bit more separation, like if this tree was just up here a little bit more.
Yeah. Or it was closer. It's either going to be next to the main tree or it's going to be balanced away from the main tree. And at the moment it looks in between the two.
Right. And you can imagine if they were like a little bit, I don't know if this is a hillside or what, but if they were like down the hill just a little bit, then all of this stuff right here would be higher. This tree would be higher. And then your visual flow would have more of a feel like that.
Yeah. And you maybe have a little bit more space on that left-hand side of the frame as well.
Yeah. But I think this is a nice idea, well executed. I just think compositionally it suffers.
Yeah. Definitely well seen.
Yep.
And I'll say that for the rest of the pictures, they're all well seen.
Yeah, I agree. The next one, I think kind of similar to what we had discussed with the pine needle image. I don't know that this photo knows what it wants to be about. You know, obviously you have this beautiful light right here.
Yeah.
But then you have these leaves up here that are blowing, so they're kind of out of focus and don't really help you much. So for me, I kind of wonder what would happen if you were to just crop some of that out. Like, that's already for me more visually interesting. I don't know if you agree or not.
I like that as a picture. What I would probably do is just take about a third off the left and right edges. So I like those leaves at the top where they're catching the sun. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's the large mass of the areas of the ground on the left and right sides that aren't adding anything to the picture. So if you take sort of like the middle third, so you end up with a 2 to 3 frame vertically, it starts to become more about that center of the frame. Mm-hmm. And you've got a picture that goes vertically then from top to bottom.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You know, good idea. Just include it a little bit too much.
I'd vignette the hell out of it as well for definitely in the bottom.
That's an interesting question.
Vignette's such an underused tool. I really think that a vignette on a picture can not overdone, but draw the attention into the center of the picture and draw away from some of the distracting elements on the edges. So for instance, on here, straight away.
Yeah, it's way better. Yeah, and we allow vignetting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are those trees in focus, by the way, or is it just my eyes?
I think they might be. It's hard to tell because these are not full res files, but I think they're okay.
I mean, one of the things you could do is use a smaller aperture. I'm not sure it'd work. Maybe have the background dropping out. It looks like it's maybe focused on the background a little bit more than the group of trees.
If I had to guess, the central tree was probably the focus point.
Yeah, possibly.
And then you have these three front trees are a little out of focus.
Yeah, and so I'd probably focus in between those two front trees.
Yeah. All right. One more. But I like that.
I mean, it's another great idea. It just needs a little refinement in terms of composition.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think I would have some of the same comments about this last image from Dennis. You know, I think compositionally and the subject matter it's interesting. You got these two V's these two forks with these two trees. But for me, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more symmetry between the two trees. And then again, like this stuff on the left-hand side, especially in the bottom left and the upper left, and really the upper right as well, they're just, they don't add anything. And if anything, it's more of a distraction.
Yeah. And the relationship between those two main elements is a little bit separated for me as well. I think when you got a couple of strong elements in a picture like that, I want to see how they interact with each other, and at the moment they don't seem to be connected. So it's like taking a picture of two people. If you take a picture of two people and there's a gap between them, it looks like they're on parade or something, or just been police lineup. What you want to do is connect them in some way. So have one slightly behind the other, or overlapping, and if it's a portrait, perhaps the heads are slightly offset. And I'd want to see these two trees close together, so you don't get as much dead space in the middle.
Yeah, and you could easily accomplish that by just moving to the left a little.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right.
Let's maybe on. Again with this one, it's a bit blown out in some of the highlights. I'm not sure if it's my monitor across the Zoom session or not. It looks okay.
Technically, it's not, but it's super close.
It's very bright up there.
Yeah, it's probably. I mean, it's right at the edge of clipping.
Right at the edge. Yeah. So maybe
let's move on to Jeffrey Knight. So Jeffrey submitted quite a few pretty good images, and I think this is actually going to be a really interesting one for us to critique, because with Jeffrey's photos overall, when I'm looking at them, my immediate reaction isn't that they have technical issues at all. In fact, I think most of them look very well technically executed, but they suffer from other issues that we're going to talk about. So let's dive in. So this is a very classic aerial photograph from the Nepali coast of Kauai, which I think we've all seen. If you're judging or looking at a lot of photos, you've seen the Nepali coast of Kauai like 1,000 times.
Yeah.
What makes this one interesting, though, is you've got these two boats that are driving away from each other that kind of pull your eye from the central thing, which is nice. And you've got some nice clouds up here. I kind of would have liked to have seen a little bit more, I don't know, like some brighter areas and some darker areas, a little bit more contrast, I guess is what I'm saying.
The blue sky in the top right corner is a real distraction for me.
Exactly.
On the sky side of things.
Just about to say that.
Yeah. Is it level, or is it just me that thinks it's not straight?
I think it's just you.
Just me. That's all right then.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if there would have been just a little bit more cloud structure up here, or like really dark clouds, and then you just have fog that kind of is spilling down in. Obviously, you can't control the weather, but I think that is the weakness of this image.
What's really strong for me is what you've said, though, the two speedboats. I mean, I know we're a natural landscape photography competition, but there's no problem about having some elements of man-made things in a picture. But those two things spiraling from the center with the two beaches are really interesting.
Very interesting, yes. Yeah, I was just playing around with some crop ideas, but
yeah,
because that is kind of the interesting part of the image.
It's a great focal point in the middle.
It is, yeah.
And there's a patch of light there that's working. I think because it's a cloudy sky, so you got this spotlight effect almost.
Yeah. All right, next image. So this is Thor's well. So I'm just going to say this right off the start, and people aren't going to like it, but the challenge with anything like this from any competition really, especially one that has experienced judges who've looked at a lot of photos, is if you're going to photograph a classic scene that we've seen 100,000 times, it's got to be done in a way that's incredibly special or unique, or kind of has your own twist on it that shows us that you're bringing something more to the table as the photographer than just showing up to a popular landmark and setting up your composition just like you've seen it before, and then capturing the scene. I mean, it's technically well executed and all that, other than maybe some color cast in the water. And
the rock in the left-hand corner is a distraction. But I would say that's very well taken, and I would agree completely. Don't stop going to classic locations because it's great fun. But if you want a picture that's going to perform well in a competition, you've got to bring something new to it. Or it's got to be just absolutely amazing. It's got to be the most amazing moment you've ever seen in that location, and nobody will ever see again.
And it's a little,
it is. It's
crooked.
cant. It's
yeah. So
it's about 1.5 degrees, is it? No, half a degree.
There you go.
Not much.
Yeah, but yeah, that would be my main thing. And then obviously, like I had said before too, like there's a little bit of a color cast too. Not that that's better, but like I'm not sure that you want weird magentas in the water.
I think it's got a profile on it probably, so it just needs those highlights.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm gonna have probably similar things to say about this image, this next one. So, personally, I am a huge fan of sun stars. I'm a sucker for them.
Yeah,
I just love them, but they got to be done super well. The technically executed, this one, the sun is too bright. You could have underexposed this quite a bit more and still pulled out all of that nice detail in the rock. And then I don't know, it almost looks a little muddy, like it was. I'm not sure if it was some noise reduction was applied to it or something, but yeah. But compositionally, I think it works okay.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have seen maybe, the flow of the image is straight ahead like a railroad track, but then you have the sun star, which kind of pulls you off of that.
The big distraction for me is the shadow line, a very strong shadow line in the middle of the gully. It's quite distracting for me. Not sure if everybody gets that, but it's a high contrast. Any high contrast edges in a picture draw your attention, and that does it for me. That's the one. Yeah. So I would be trying to find a way of saying, well, if I'm going to have a shadow on there, I've got to try and use it as a feature of the picture. And you could say it's a feature of the picture here, but I don't think it's working quite as well. As far as a sun star goes, as you say, sun stars can be good, but they're really polarizing as well. So you're going to get some judges that won't like them. And if half the judges don't like them, we have a system that allows one judge to bring things forward to the final selection. But at some point, the judge is going to have some agreement on something. So the chances of something that is polarizing doing really well, unless you can convince all those other judges, is less. So, and again, if it's going to be done, it needs to be done exceptionally well. And you're right about the bracketing. I completely agree, because what's happened here is you've had to do a lot of highlight recovery. And when you get highlight recovery, it destroys the color. So you've got some desaturation going on around the sun. So that blue sky, which should be going on all the way through to the sun, has lost its color. And some of the yellow that maybe was there as well. Whereas if you'd have bracketed it, you could have some nice recovery. You could have almost just like a dot star sun in the middle.
Yeah.
And the flare in the top right is slightly distracting, the green flare.
Yeah, that guy. Yeah. For me though, I think compositionally there's a lot of promise to this image. There just wasn't. There just isn't a central focal point to capitalize on the good idea of the composition. You have all of these nice lines with the sandstone coming in like this, right? All these angles. Yeah. But then there's nothing.
The clouds arcing in as well.
There's nothing there, like that's the problem. Like if you're gonna use those elements, there's got to be something that you're pointing us to as the viewer, and they're just really. Yes, you have this nice pattern here, but I would have liked to see maybe like a tree in there, or something to capture my attention would have been nice to have as a focal point there to capitalize on that composition. And then I was curious what your thoughts are on this, Tim. So I do a lot of photography in the desert Southwest, and in slot canyons in particular, it can be really challenging because you get these footprints. Right? I don't know if you can see all those footprints.
I can.
What are your thoughts on getting rid of those in our rules? They're transient, right?
In terms of cloning them, I'm still on. What would I do with those? There's a lot to clone out. I would probably walk into the frame and just ruffle them with my finger to make them not stand out. The ones in the background, don't bother me as much anyway visually. If
Yeah,
it's
it's
something
just
that
these
harsh
ones.
edge in the foreground,
Yeah, it's just these few.
just knock
I
it
think
out with your fingers.
I think what I would do is I would use a tool in Photoshop called frequency separation, where you
Yeah.
can separate color and texture, and then you can
Yep.
just paint in a different texture.
Yeah.
That's what I would do, because technically I think it's allowed in our rules because it's
You could
footprints are
easily paint in
transient.
some. You could paint in some exposure lift on the shadow areas around the footprint as well, and that would
Yeah.
subdue it.
Okay.
If those shadows weren't there, you wouldn't be able to see the footprints.
Right. So the next image.
Oh, as a matter of interest, by the way, on that sharp, harsh shadow that is at the bottom left, you can. What I might do with that harsh shadow is lighten up the edge of the shadow and darken the edge of the highlight, so you create more of a transition. So it's less of a distraction. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, make it more
So
of
you
a
like
gradient.
blurring it, but doing it with exposure.
Okay. All right, moving on to the next one. Big wave crashing, Oregon coast, I'm pretty sure.
That's a famous wave, isn't it? Because I see a lot of pictures of this.
Yeah, I've never spent much time in that part of the Oregon coast, so I'm not gonna pretend to know the exact location, but I've seen this composition a lot, which is probably for me why it didn't score highly on my part, just because I have seen this photo a lot.
Yeah. I think
It's
this was probably one of the ones
technically
that
well
stands
done.
out as not being done as well compositionally as well. I don't think it's a great composition with a surf in the foreground and the cliff
Oh,
on the left
interesting.
being a little bit.
I like that surf in the
Yeah,
foreground. I
there you
do.
go.
I do.
Taste. Oh,
In fact, what I don't like is all of these trees on the top left.
yeah, I'd agree. The left-hand edge of the image is
Just a
a bit odd.
little, like maybe something like, I don't know, like something like this works a little more for me. I don't know. I might be even, I don't know. It's hard to say. There's a
Yeah,
lot of, there's a lot going on. I mean, for me, that's even a little more strong, just because you
yeah,
don't have that competing stuff in the corner to draw you away from what's really happening here. But
agreed.
yeah, it's a classic shot. I think it's one of those scenes that unfortunately you suffer from what Guy Tall calls repetition suppression.
Yep.
Next one. So this one's super different, right? Like this is not a scene I've seen before myself. I think there's a lot of interesting elements here. You've got a really cool blue kind of window archway
Yeah,
into the ocean out there. For me, what doesn't work is all of this right here.
too much of it, and with
It's
footprints and stuff.
Yeah, like it takes up a huge amount of your photograph and doesn't help you at all. Like that just doesn't add to anything for
Might
me.
just get rid of the bottom half of the picture for that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
I
it's the
mean,
pool reflection. The pool is also something that's distracting me because you've got the highlights of that reflection.
right. Something like this. Maybe even pull in a little.
Yep.
Yeah,
The original thing about that is that blue window, little keyhole, and then the bright greens as
yeah.
contrasting colours. These
Yeah, I like
plays
the
up on the,
play. I like the play
yeah,
between those two things a lot.
exactly.
But in the original image, you just have this huge
Yeah,
area that doesn't help you, doesn't add to the subject at all. So
nice idea though. With a crop like that, you got more of a sweeping line coming in with the gully or wherever it's called.
yep, cool. All right. Another one. Looks like it was probably taken in the redwoods. I will just say this, photographing the redwoods is one of the most challenging things I've ever done in my entire life. Compositionally, it's it's very difficult, especially if you don't have a lot of fog, which he had a little fog, which is nice. But I'll say for this image, the biggest challenge is that you have the biggest part of your photograph in terms of real estate is this tree on the right-hand side. And I don't think it stands on its own enough to take up that much visual weight. And then you don't have enough interest in other parts of the photo to balance it out.
Yeah.
But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a tough one. creating structure in areas like this is very difficult. But there's too much weight on the right-hand side of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And because you've got the open highlight to the right-hand side of the tree, that's too much of a bit of a distraction. So if you're going to have a really heavy tree like that on the edge of a picture, you don't want anything to the right-hand side of it, unless you don't want a little bit of something on the right-hand side of it. It's either got to be obviously something to the right-hand side of it or nothing, especially when it's highlights. You're looking into the sky like that. Whereas that starts to... The tree then is a cropping feature. It's a bracketing feature. Yeah, that would be a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah, and it looks like he probably had a little bit of wind too, and some of these ferns I think might be a little out of focus as well.
I don't mind a little bit of that as long as the foreground ones aren't too bad.
Right.
But that's more of a picture for me. The background is working well.
Mm-hmm.
So combining that with a better selection of foreground would turn it into something a lot stronger.
Yep, I agree. And I think this is another one of those situations where our friend Jeffrey here had a good idea. He saw something. He's like, oh, this scene has tremendous potential. And then he just didn't quite nail the composition. Otherwise, everything else looks good. All right, next one from Jeffrey. I thought this one was super interesting. I think this is in Oregon as well, if I'm not mistaken. I think I've driven by that mountain a few times. It's near Crater Lake, I believe. I could be wrong though, but I'm sure he'll put in the comments that I'm wrong. But I kind of like the way these big trees create these lines with the smaller trees. I'm trying to figure out what it is about this image that I didn't like before. I think it might have been some of the color story in the sky with the foreground. It doesn't quite work for me. Like that snow is gray, and for me, like the snow needs to be bright white, and it's almost like a teal gray color. In fact, if you look at it, yeah, it looks like it's gray, right?
Yeah.
So I would have liked to have seen the snow to be quite a bit brighter. And again, you can fix some of that using the tone curve a bit, and obviously you can preserve some of the highlights in the sky from getting cooked using other techniques. But I would have liked to see a lot brighter snow, and not quite as, like I said, I think it's almost like a weird teal color or something. Yeah,
it's sort of blue hour, isn't it? Because it's almost post sunset where the guy's standing,
right?
And you got that blue sky above, just throwing blue light down.
Yeah, and it just kills me when I see blue snow. I don't know what it is. I don't like it.
I think the biggest issue is the use of these big linear trees in the picture, and it's not that I don't like them. It's the one on the left-hand side is too close to the edge of the frame to be such a feature. It's not a feature tree, but it's so distracting sitting there on that left-hand edge of the frame. The middle one, it's intrusive, but it doesn't bother me quite as much. And the two right-hand ones,
what if it was more balanced?
It's not part of the frame.
What if it was more balanced like that? I mean, obviously
it's still refreshing on my screen, but
yeah, I just basically just cropped off the right-hand side.
Slightly.
No, I just got rid of the whole right-hand side.
Oh, okay, that would work. Yeah. There you got balance across those two large trees then. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other
don't
thing
be
I
afraid
think
to crop your images.
Yeah, the other thing I think it is used is negative clarity to try and reduce the impact of those very dark trees that are coming into the frame. And it's something I've seen quite a few times. When you use negative clarity, it basically adds a blur of some sort. In a way, it does a few things, but if you look at the area around the black tree, you've got this black glow around the trees.
Oh, yeah. That's almost like Orton.
It's like an Orton glow sort of thing. So it might be an attempt to do that. But when you've got it against a sky like that, it looks a little bit peculiar to me.
Yeah. Well, to me, it's just like, oh, they used Orton.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff going on there, and I think the choice of foreground would have made a difference. So, you could have perhaps walked into the scene once you've taken this picture and got past some of those big trees and taken another photograph or moved around to have a different distribution of them. Because I'm quite interested in the idea of these tall ones on the right-hand side that don't cut the top of the frame.
Yes.
Yeah, that could be an interesting feature.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, imagine if you had a drone and you could just get a little higher, looking down more.
Yeah, I mean, the background is just to die for. It's beautiful.
Oh, it's killer. I mean, it's beautiful light. I think this is one of those scenes, like it had a lot of potential. It's different. I've never seen this composition before, but the composition was just a little flawed, and then some editing issues.
With the way it is at the moment, I think that central one is just too distracting, too intrusive.
Yeah, that's true.
Without the central tree, the left and right ones almost bracket the picture in a way that wouldn't bother me as much.
Right, I agree.
But,
okay, yeah. Here's a nice flowing creek with wildflowers and an awesome mountain at sunset. I mean, or sunrise. I'm sure that was incredible to see. I think compositionally, it's the right idea. You've got the scene is leading you up the frame to the mountain. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more water coming up a little bit further up into the frame. I'm trying to so for me, some of the issues that caught my eye, you've got this black haloing. Oh, that's way too big. You got this black haloing of the trees here.
Is that the autumn thing again? Possibly.
It's either that or it's when you do too much highlight recovery.
Yeah.
I think that can cause some of that, where you have things that are superimposed over the highlights that then get darkened. So you got to be careful of that. And then I don't know, like there's something about the light up here it's almost a little over edited or over processed. The colors are just a little too, I don't know. It's just, it doesn't look quite natural to me.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, it's not way over the top, but I think what it is where those orange highlights have come, where you got the direct sun. When you do a highlight recovery, you can sometimes end up with getting a bit greeny yellow with a highlight recovery as well. So it might be something to do with that. The distractions for me with pictures like this, and it is absolutely utterly beautiful, and it's so well composed. That central part of it, if we ignore the bottom half of the picture and the top half of the picture, it's absolutely gorgeous and really nicely composed. The left-hand bank of the cliff there with a sharp, harsh diagonal, and it's clear of foliage, is one of the flaws in the picture for me.
This here,
that bank, yeah. And possibly there's a bit too much at the bottom of the picture, and I'm surprised this didn't get 3 stars because it is very good.
Yeah, I think it's the editing. I think especially I know Alex, if he sees something that's got any editing stuff going on, he's like 0, 1, something like that.
I gave it a 3 because I think it's that composition in the middle is very, very good, and it is. You know, we see a lot of pictures like this, to be honest, in the competition, and often they are just so nice, but you end up scoring it for its flaws rather than its positives. I think.
It's a good image, though. It's a very good image.
I think it's the strongest one out of the set, from probably, in my opinion.
Yeah, let's keep going. This is White Pocket. I've been here. I love White Pocket. It's incredible. I've actually photographed this exact same rock formation in Blue Hour. It's amazing. I think compositionally, this photograph works pretty well. You've got these lines that kind of pull you up into here. You've got the clouds that are doing the same thing. You have your central area of focus here. You've got lines coming in this way, lines coming in this way. I think, if I'm going to be honest, the thing that this image suffers from the most is that it's a very popular location that's been photographed a ton.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not different enough from what we've seen before. And what I will say is the biggest positive in this picture is the sky being complementary to the subject matter.
Agreed.
That is probably what transforms it more than anything else. You know, if it didn't have the sky in it, it would just be a straight no. But I quite like the sky, so I probably gave it a 2 or 3, maybe a 3.
Yeah, and I like the blue contrast with the red.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if it's about the sky, then it should be about the sky. So have less foreground, use the sky. And
Yeah.
this is about choosing what it is, what's unique about my picture, what is transformative.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, it's just tough to impress judges who have seen a specific composition or a variation
yeah,
of it without
yeah,
something else. It's tough.
agreed.
So this image, I think, is one of the weaker. In fact, he got 1 star on this image. For me, compositionally, there's just not much that interesting. You have this light here. That's about the only thing that draws my attention. It's kind of overpowering the rest of the photograph. It would have been nice to see a little bit of shadow recovery in some of the rocks here. Again, that's a huge amount of real estate to take up, especially, and you have this over here too. It's completely black and doesn't really have any texture. Like this area up here has texture, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I think compositionally they have the right idea. Like everything's kind of pointing to the right thing,
Yeah.
but it's not very interesting other than it, I'm sure that was gorgeous to witness.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I will say about the light as well, I mean, the light's beautiful, but there's a great big black rock in front of it where the light's pointing, which is just blocking my view of the picture, as it were, or the flow of the picture.
Yep. That's a good point. I don't think we need to spend any more time on that one.
Yep.
So another Oregon image. I wonder if Jeffrey lives in Oregon. But again, sorry, Jeffrey, I lived in Portland for 2 years. I've driven by this particular scene about 50 times. It's 45 minutes from Portland, a very popular composition with the Columbia River. Really nice light. I actually really think the edit here is strong. I mean, I think of this scene, this is one of the better photographs that I've seen of it. But again, I think he suffers from, it's just something we've seen before.
Yeah, the treatment for me is a little bit blue and hazy. Maybe I'm not sure if that's the actual the seeing conditions or not. But yeah, I mean, we know the composition and the frame.
Yeah,
there's doing nothing new with the location.
Yeah, so I mean,
and perhaps we are slightly harsher with this because there are images that maybe poorer photographically they get through to the second round than images of more iconic locations. So we probably do punish iconic locations or seemingly great photographs from good locations don't do generally that well.
I was going to say, it's probably worth pointing out real quick in our rules. If you go to our website and you go to terms and conditions, I think it's in this section. In the additional guidelines section, it does say, our competition emphasizes creativity and unique images, so we highly encourage photographers to avoid familiar or iconic compositions.
No, so, we do say compositions, not places. So
that's right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is
place is fine.
Yeah, place is fine, but maybe try to get your own take on it or your own twist on it. But overall, Jeffrey, I think you submitted some really interesting work. Let's move on to Joel. So Joel, we've got quite a selection of various images here. Mostly looks like details and abstracts for the most part. And I'll be curious to get some of your thoughts on these ones because I feel like some of these compositions are pretty interesting. And I'd be curious for us to have a conversation about why they didn't move on. Particularly, I'm drawn to this image.
Sorry, which one?
It's got some reeds and it's kind of it's just a reflection.
The red background. Yeah.
And then there's a similar version here. Because what I think this is interesting is it almost looks like a landscape with different sky. I mean, there's images that did really well in the competition with similar ideas.
Yeah.
So
I like it.
So let's go through them and pick them apart. So the first one is this wood texture photo. I think this is another one of those examples where we saw quite a few images very similar to this entered into the competition. So then it just became a process of elimination to determine which ones stood out the best. For me, I was just going to say, for me, like, I think this one suffers a lot from just, it's a little bit out of focus and nothing seems to be quite sharp.
If we're on the blue, purpley and white tree with bits of yellow on, then I really like this picture. I thought it was really well composed, but it doesn't look, it's not, the edges and the bits where the holes are and the whorls are really nice. It's got that sort of Van Gogh feel to it, but the middle of it's just not strong. I don't know why. It's missing a subject. It has me wandering around the perimeter of the frame,
Yes.
rather than looking at the center.
Right. Yeah, and I think that sometimes can be a risk because then you just risk falling off the frame and losing interest.
Yeah, it needs some of these walls to be in the middle of the picture and have a focal point for the composition. But the idea like and the structure of that I thought was very good.
I feel like it's a little dark as well. Like this is probably too much, but I feel like just adding a little bit more brightness to it would have added a little bit as well. That's me. Okay.
Yeah,
let's move on to the next one.
Yep.
So I hate to say it, but this is kind of the same commentary on the last image. We saw a lot of photographs that looked very similar to this one with sand patterns and things like that. And it's a nice idea. It's executed fine, but it's just, there's not enough interest in the image to make me want to score it higher than a 2.
My take on a lot of these pictures is it needs a series of interesting things going on. So, okay, we've got a sort of sand pattern with this V shape or Y shape with some nice light on it. Okay, that's cool. What else has it got? It hasn't really got anything else.
Right.
So
no, I agree.
And I think that's what I do when I'm out taking pictures myself. Is I go, okay, what else is there? What else is there? And if I can see a series of things building up to keep my interest, then it starts to become engaging for me. And this is an idea that, and I'm not being detrimental. You can go to a lot of beaches on a low angle sun in the evening and get something very similar. So the potential to get something like that is easy. So there's going to be a lot of people out there doing it and submitting something similar. So it has to have a lot more in it for it to be successful.
Yeah. The next image, I feel like, is kind of the same issue. I feel like this is a slightly stronger image than the last one. You just have these two competing lines and then a lot of empty space. And you got a lot of really interesting textures and patterns. But again, I think this is another one of those instances where there's a lot of images that are very similar to this one that have been entered. And so for it to stand out, maybe there just has to have something else.
This needs the light from the previous picture.
Yeah, good call.
Yeah, it's a little bit flat, would be my criticism of it. I love the idea of these intersecting lines, but the rest of the picture is a little flat.
Yeah, and I mean, interestingly, he has similar images here. Like here's another one with that same type of light. I think you could probably make the exact same statement about this particular image. He's got this image, which is also kind of the same idea. You've got textures. Again, like
that's more interesting, that one. But
it is.
There's a lot. The highlights in the top, middle, and bottom left are drawing me in a bit too much because the textures in the middle are quite nice again. But
Yep. And so again, I think it's important when people are looking at their photographs and what they want to submit, look at what's the weakest aspect of your image and how can you eliminate that? Can you crop it? Can you maybe process it a little bit differently? Because if something's going to draw your eye to something like that, and it's not because it's something you want to draw attention to, then you have to imagine that that's what the judges are going to do as well.
Yeah.
I want to go back to this image. I feel like this is probably the strongest image he submitted.
Agree.
There's a lot of interest here. it reminds me almost like of a painting.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how he could have improved it or why it didn't make it into the next round of the competition.
Looking at this, I personally, I think I'd find it surprising that it didn't do better.
So you're saying that we're flawed, that we're humans and we're flawed, and sometimes we miss things?
I think there's one thing going against these pictures is really interesting, but as soon as you've worked out that it's an upside down image, a lot of the magic disappears. So you need to be able to switch that part of your brain off and appreciate it for what it is, because as soon as you interpret it on looking at it upside down, it's like these 3D puzzles that flip from one face to the other. Mm-hmm. And if your brain flips into the I know it's an upside down picture, it loses a lot of the magic. And that's down to each individual person interpreting it. So it can go from really interesting to, it's just an upside down picture. And I think that's possibly what's happened is like, I might have given it a 3. Alex or yourself may have thought that doesn't work, or Rajesh may have thought, well, it doesn't work, it's just a reflection. In terms of what it could be done better, I think the black bar across the bottom is just a little bit too blocked up, maybe. So, and the whole top right-hand side is a bit bright. So I'd want to try and draw a little bit more attention back into the center of the image. Because I love the reeds. The reeds in the top are really nice, the way they sort of fade out to nothing.
Yeah, like this is probably the most interesting part of the image, right?
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. I mean, you could almost strengthen the image by just doing a little bit of a crop. I wonder if that would.
And I'd also, can you put a grad over the top of the image to just try and make the top darker?
Yeah, of course.
So it's almost like a vignette over the top of the image.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, just to kind of keep your eye from escaping.
That's it, because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with the mountain reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it less obvious that it's a reflection, I think, there.
Yeah, I think you're right. And he has a similar image, this one.
This is the one I thought would come up first when I was talking about it. You can't work out whether it's the reflection or the reeds are the bits of interest, so they're just clashing with each other.
Right. Yeah, and there's a little bit of distracting elements in the top of the frame for me. And I think it's almost a little too dark in the darks.
That top left-hand corner is definitely too dark. And
it's
obvious that it's a bit of the shoreline as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting idea. I think it just needs to be executed a little differently. In particular, this stuff up here it keeps pulling my eye off of the frame.
Yeah.
So
anything that signals it's a reflection really gives it away. So like the bursts of grass in the middle left, or the diagonal bits of grass that are sticking out, immediately signify that it's a reflection.
Right.
What's really interesting in this picture for me, I think, is some of that. Is it probably ice at the very bottom of the picture, underneath the reflection of the trees? Right. Those textures are really interesting.
Yeah, I just wish I could see a little bit more of them.
Yeah. So anyway, it's a nice idea, but I think it's just a little bit too cluttered to work well. Yeah,
and then let's look at this image. I don't know if this is ICM or just a long exposure.
I think it's a bit of ICM, yeah.
Yeah, and so again, so not to reharp on this, but for ICM to work, it's got to have like the resulting image has to create another idea. It can't just be like, oh, it's stuff that's been blurred by moving the camera. There has to be something else going on here. And for me, like when I look at an image like this, I'm trying to see if I can come up with anything like, oh, is there something else here that I'm missing? And for me, I'm not seeing anything else.
I'll tell you, the thing that engages me in that picture is the squiggles in the bottom right-hand corner.
Yeah.
They're sort of wriggling up the picture. So it's a pattern that's engaged me. Whereas the rest of it, I don't know, it's just some wavy grasses.
Right. Yeah, and you said it. And when it comes to ICM, if it's like, oh, it's just that, then for
Yeah.
me, that makes it hard for it to capture the abstract power that
Yeah.
ICM can hold.
Which
'Cause-
bit's the magic? And if it's because they are very pretty, aren't they? I mean, they're a great way of making a pretty image is using ICM, but we all know that. So we know that you've got to make it magic. It's got to have something extra.
Right, right, or like the intentional camera movement creates something that's greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Let's look at this grand scenic. I'm always a big fan of kind of minimalistic seascapes with, especially with the moon. Like I think that's probably like the moon and maybe Venus or something like that.
Yeah.
And you just have the one tiny little sea stack sticking up. I think it's a fine image, but it's one of those issues where it's like it needs a little bit more or less. Like some of the stuff in the bottom, like this kind of stuff is sort of distracting for me.
Yeah.
I would have maybe even liked to seen this stuff a little bit more blurry, honestly, because it's competing for the visual weight here and up here and the relationship between those two objects.
Yeah. I
But then
think
you
the
have this
black
stuff
little
down.
sea stack is just a little bit too uninteresting, messy, to engage as well. It's you look at it, see it, it's not particularly interesting, so you don't come back to it.
Yeah, now what if it
almost,
was like a really cool looking sea
yeah,
stack?
exactly. Yeah, it's got
That
to
had
engage you again, hasn't it?
a bird up here or something.
It's when you need your
All right.
trained falcon.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
can just
exactly.
clone something in, be fine.
All right, let's look at this tree, or maybe it's like a bush. So it's really hard for these kind of images to do well, especially when you have so much of real estate that's out of focus here in the foreground.
Yeah, I mean that would be a straight no for me.
Yeah, it just doesn't work for me. I would have just excluded it altogether. Just crop it.
Yeah,
crop it to here or something. But
I think
even
this is the
then,
weakest. This is the weakest picture out of this set for me.
yeah, I could see that. And then a lot of the foliage is out of focus too. So it's like the only thing that seems to be in focus is the trunk.
Yeah,
Which doesn't really take up that much space for the photo. And
that little bit, the trunk in the center, is quite an interesting view, though. The way it's structured and the way the branches are coming out of holes in it and things. So that's the real subject of the picture. In which case, maybe just use that central part of the picture as the core of it.
yeah, now imagine something like this.
Yeah. And there's some elliptical little holes in as well in the other areas. Yeah, I mean that's showing more interest in terms of what it is.
My guess is that's what caught their
subject
attention.
matter.
That's what caught their attention. But then
I think so. Yeah, yeah.
the rest of it just didn't complement what he had found.
Yeah.
Okay, got time to do one more?
Yeah, go on.
Okay, let's do Susan. Susan submitted quite a few black and whites. And it's worth noting that we have a black and white award for NLPA year 3. So we hope to see some really high quality black and whites this year. It looks like several of these are taken in Iceland. I mean, that is Vic, I'm pretty sure.
It is, yeah.
I think this is hard to say. But
there's definitely a mix of places. You got mangrove swamps and deserts and
yeah, so should we just go through them?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, this first one has a lot of contrast and almost a little too much contrast for me, for my personal preference. I love contrast, but the biggest weakness for this image for me is like it's almost too bright for those rocks. They're a little too bright for me. And then you have these branches or these bushes sticking up from the bottom that I don't really think are helping.
No, well, if you're going to have a very high contrast image like this, it needs to have strong structure. and not much going on in the areas that have been clipped black almost. And in this case,
Right.
we've got two major clouds at the top that almost match the two rocks that don't sort of
Right.
complement each other in a way. So it's too contrasty for what it is.
Yeah, and then when I'm looking at images, especially during pre-screening, one of the very first things I'm looking for is stuff like this dust spot.
Yeah, technical flaws.
Because
It's
for
probably worth
me,
saying when we're going through the images at the start, we are asking ourselves, can this win? Is
absolutely.
there any situation where this wins? And if there are technical flaws, we know that the judges will see them.
Exactly. Yep. And for me, like it just shows a little bit of carelessness in terms of looking at the photo before you upload it. Let's look at this one. This looks like maybe Yosemite. A few things that kind of caught my attention with this one. You got a lot of stuff in the photo that is distracting you on the edges, and I
Are we zoomed
don't.
into that, by the way? Or is it just my screen?
No, this is it's. Oh no, I think you're right. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Well, now there's even more. So you got this one, you got these, you got all of this stuff up here. This little bright area of the tree over here doesn't work. You probably could have cropped it and it would have worked a lot better. I think what they've done well is as a reflection, they've exposed it well. I think the exposure looks pretty spot on. Nothing looks like it's clipped or anything like that. But in terms of visual interest, I like my eye keeps looking at the reflection. I don't not this stuff up here doesn't really help too much for me at the top.
Yeah. I think when you've got reflections and there's blank skies, when featureless skies, they become quite stark in the way that they work opposite each other. So I'd be, if I was faced with that, I'd be saying, well, I'm either using the top bit or the bottom bit.
That's a lot of real estate.
Yeah, I mean, it can work on its own if the subject's sitting there against it, but with the same thing going on at the bottom where the gradient is there, it doesn't work as strongly. And another thing is with a famous location, it gets knocked down slightly again.
Right, unless it's just knocks your socks off. So here's another one. I feel like the challenge with this particular image is you have a lot of clouds that I don't know. It just looks like a cloudy day on the coast for me, and it looks crooked a little. Like it's kind of going that way.
The interest for me here is in the channel between the reeds and the way the grasses work, and then with the building in the background. So that's the character of the picture.
Yeah. And I can speak for myself, but when I'm looking at images during pre-screening and I see the central focus of the image is a building, like doesn't do it for me. I don't like I know it's hard because a lot of the landscape out there has man-made structures on it, but
it's a focal point, isn't it? Yeah,
it is, right? Because it's everything's kind of pointing that way. It's moving your eye up into that. So I think composing it a little differently or even excluding any of that stuff, you could have had an interesting image with just this part of the frame.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't matter if the buildings just sat on the horizon at the top of the frame and the picture was obviously about the channel.
Agreed. Yep. So here's the Vic photo. I mean, right off for me, I would have marked it down right away because I immediately recognized the scene, and then right away I'm like, okay, it's a photo of Vic. What makes it special? And immediately I'm thinking, well, then it's got too many flaws. It's crooked. The horizon's crooked, for starters. You've got this huge space up here that doesn't really help you tell a story. And then you've got this black line down here So it's like pulling my attention away from those interesting C stacks. So your attention's going this way instead of this way, for me anyway.
No, I'd agree. The sky's nice behind it. I'll say that. There's some interesting stuff going on in the cloud there.
Yeah, I agree.
But yeah, as a picture of a silhouette of Vic against the sky, it's one of many.
Right. So if you're gonna show us that scene, show it to us in a way that we've never seen before. I think this is pretty much similar themes of what we've seen from the other images. You've got a lot of competing elements for your attention. You have a big sky that's bright. I don't know about you, but my eye immediately goes up here and up here, and there's nothing really there.
Well, the sky, I think the reason they took the picture is the sky. It's an amazing set of clouds.
Yes.
And in that situation where you don't have much else going on, just make it about the sky. Just put a tiny strip of land at the bottom end of it, at the bottom of the picture, and make everything about the sky. It is the interesting thing of the picture, after all.
Something like that. Yeah. Yep. And then a couple other things, like we look for things like this in prejudging, but over sharpening where you have halos around the edges on the horizons, those kind of things, those catch our attention pretty quickly as well. So just be judicious and brutal when you're looking through your images and look for those kind of things. I think this is probably their strongest image that they submitted.
Yeah, I like this. Yeah,
I like it a lot more than the rest of them, for sure. You have this nice sweeping line coming from the bottom right.
Skeletal trees are lovely.
Yeah, these are awesome. Well processed. I would have liked to see a little bit more detail in here.
Yeah,
because right now it just kind of blocks you up and keeps your eye from kind of wanting to continue up into here.
We've got the sky, the band of dark in the clouds. I think this is one of those situations where you've got those wave clouds going on above the clouds, where you've got thick bands and thin bands of sky. Yep. And so you've got quite a very dark area for a sky along that strip, and then you get the big light areas in between the stripes, in between the waves.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, Tim. When it comes to skies, when you're looking at your own photos of skies, I am always trying to make sure, as much as I can, that the brightest clouds are not at the edge, if that makes sense.
If possible, yeah.
If I can.
I'll put a vignette against them or bring them down, etc. to do it. Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, across the whole picture, I'll try and make sure the brightest area isn't at the edge of the picture.
Right. Another thing, like this left-hand side over here, this tree doesn't really help you much. It's kind of junky.
The road's a distraction as well, because it draws your eye.
Yeah. So, what if you just did something like that,
Yeah.
It's more like this, it emphasizes the strongest aspects of the image. You still have the nice sky.
Just took a bit of shadow recovery on it as well at the same time.
Yeah, just a little. Not a lot, just a little.
Just enough to bring out some of those areas in the background.
Yeah. Let's look at... Oh, go ahead.
No, go on, it's okay.
I was just let's look at one more.
Okay.
Let's look at this one. So, a couple things that I'm going to immediately point out for this photograph. So again, it's the Natural Landscape Photography Awards. So in this case, you have a man-made step here. You have a man-made trail here. And you have a fence here. And look at how much real estate those subjects take up with your landscape.
I should say that wouldn't exclude it from me, but it wouldn't be a positive.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, it's like I'm okay with man-made structures appearing in the frame, but they shouldn't take up a ton of the space.
There is also something about decay in man-made parts of the frame as well. For instance, like the and it's been written about since the Romantic era, that we have an interest in the way that man-made objects decay and collapse. They become more natural, basically, over time. So, for instance, maybe this fence looks like it's quite old and it's lived in a bit and it's started to become part of the landscape.
I was going to say, this part of the fence here is actually really nice.
Yeah. Whereas the path is quite prominent and it looks like it's a thoroughfare. And is it a pool or is it just a rock that's in the bottom left? It's just a piece of rock, is it?
Just like a rock, yeah.
Yeah, that's intrusive for me. It's a shame because I quite like the way that the fence works on the right-hand side edge, but I'd say that's intrusive. The big thing's intrusive for me is that it's been over sharpened or over claritied or something.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really, really harsh contrast on the edges.
I was going to say, you can really pick it up in some of this.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and this is another one of those situations where excluding objects could help. I don't think the sky is doing you much of a favor. I don't think you need much of this stuff on the left-hand side. I think that weird part of the fence that you don't like is also not doing any favors. So, if you cropped it down to something like this, it completely changes what's emphasized, right? Which now the emphasis is more on this stuff. Which if this
the textures of the hillside and the sea and the U shape.
Right. So I think it's important to just think about, like, what are the most interesting parts of my image and how can I draw attention to those with my composition? So,
but I think they'd recognize something very strong there, and it was there was a lot of good stuff in it. Yeah,
and I think maybe perhaps not for the Natural Landscape Photography Awards, something like this with a fence could work pretty well.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've looked at a nice variety of images. I wanted to end us on to do one more thing. So we just wanted to show a few images from a portfolio that did well. And this is Alberto. We just wanted to kind of point out some of the differences between like a portfolio that did well with the judges contrasted with some of the portfolios we just looked at. And his images did well, but none of them actually won any prizes, but he still was in top contention.
I think we got one in the book, I think.
Yeah, I think this upper left one is in the book.
That's right, yeah.
If I'm not mistaken. But let's maybe just kind of go through these real quick, just to kind of talk about what we like about these and maybe critique them if we want to. But for me, what I really like about this particular image, a couple things. One, it's very unique. Like, I haven't seen this image anywhere before. It doesn't rely on particularly epic conditions or anything like that. But what it does is it utilizes light as the composition. So the way that the light has shaped everything and drawn attention and created kind of this interesting patterns of kind of holding your eye into the middle parts of the image. For me, that is very successful. And you've got this bush down here, which nicely anchors the bottom right. This doesn't take up too much real estate, although that might be the weakest part of the photo. This nicely balances the upper left. This nicely balances the upper right. There's just a lot of symmetry, and you can just see like how everything just comes together really nicely that way. So what about for you, Tim?
Yeah, the backlit plants I thought was fantastic, and it's the color contrast between the sandstone and the yellowy greens that I thought was really nice. And you got the desert varnish that's gone slightly blue, so there's a nice color variation in the frame. In terms of the shape, it's got a real three-dimensionality to it. You can feel there's like a root into the picture through the middle, slightly right, going left behind those rocks, and you can see that it could go right again. So it's got a really nice three-dimensionality to it and progression through the frame. And each part of the picture has a textural variety to it as well. So you've got these orangey yellows at the cliff on the left-hand side, got the desert varnish in the background. Each bit of cliff has its own geological interest, like the layering on the right-hand side cliff. You've got some diagonal layering and a discontinuity, and the foreground acts as an introduction to the picture. Is almost like a little path there you could imagine in the foreground. So each part of the picture is playing its own role, but as it's all brought together, you've got a nice three-dimensional structure to it. So it invites me in.
Yeah, and this is one of those examples of where I feel like the photographer has brought some part of themselves to the photograph. They didn't just roll up to a iconic destination with great conditions and push the shutter. They had to probably meticulously compose this and think about how they wanted to use these elements and arrange them in such a way that creates that 3D dimensionality and the patterning and whatnot. So I think it's a good example of kind of what we're looking for in NLPA. Let's move on to the next one. So this is actually a very popular destination in Utah. It's pretty sure this is Pariah. I've been here a couple times, and I probably would have scored it a little bit lower because of that, just because I recognize it, and I recognize this exact outcropping of rocks from something that I know where I know exactly how to find it. But I think what this image does well is there's a lot of interesting patterns and colors. So you have like orange, white, orange, white, and then you have a mimicking of that up here with different colors. You have white, pink, orange, white, so there's nice layers happening here. And I think they've done a great job of kind of adding some contrast. So you have shadow areas and you have bright areas. I think visually the flow is pretty nice because you have these lines that kind of take you around the frame like this. So it keeps your eye kind of moving throughout the photograph. So, I mean, those are the things that I like. I mean, there's not anything particularly negative about it that I can say, oh, this is terrible.
Yeah, and the lighting is so complementary as well. You can see there is some direct lighting in the background at the far back right, but as you come towards the foreground, it gets softer and softer, and that softer lighting is creating a three-dimensional shaping to the foreground. You're not getting too much contrast. You're getting a little bit of cool in the shadows, a little warm in the highlights. And I think for me, it's the lighting. The composition is nice. As you say, it's a famous place, but it's the lighting that's really making it work for me.
Yeah. And, like I said, when we're prejudging, the first thing we're doing is we're looking for things that are distractions or that are technical flaws, things like that. And so when you look at an image like this, you can't find any, right? So that's important. And not to say that it's perfect. I mean, in terms of like, we don't want sterile nature photos, right? But I mean, there's definitely things that are quote unquote distractions, but they're not overly distracting. I mean, like, there's stuff up here. Some of these bushes people might find distracting, but they're not.
That's it. I think the top right-hand corner is probably the least is the poor bit of the frame, let's say, but it's not distracting enough to take it away. And in fact, it does inform of the lighting a little bit. So
yep. Moving on, I think this is one of my favorites, just in terms of it's so interesting, because what I like about this one is you have multiple levels of contrast. You have texture, you have lines, and you have color, and they're all competing for your attention to create this multi-dimensional image of different things that are just drawing your interest that I like.
Yeah, it's I presume I'm guessing it might be coastal, but what plays really well here is the color variation. I think that's the big sell here. You got from the warms and reds going through to sort of like malachite greens. You got some sort of lilac-y purples in the shadowed areas, and you've got this almost scaly, herringbony geological structure going through it. And then as you go to each bit of it, you can look closer and you can see texture within each part. So there's veins in the rocks, there's cracks that form it. So it's each part of the image is doing something interesting, either color-wise or texture-wise, and then the overall structure is working. And there's not really, there's weaker parts of the picture, definitely, but nothing that's distracting from the whole.
Yeah, what I like is you have this area over here that's got the gnarly texture, and then you have these slabs of smooth rock,
Yeah,
and then it gets gnarly again, and then you have smooth, and then you have gnarly again. So you have these kind of repeating patterns of texture, and then you have repeating
yeah.
patterns of color. And then the way that the photographer composed it was, I think, pretty genius too, because there's a nice flow with using these cracks that
Yeah.
really kind of pull you in and keep you exploring the frame. So I think that works.
A difficult picture to compose with something like that as well, because there are, the black diagonal line in the bottom right, it could be quite difficult to work with, but he's framed it nicely, used it as part of the structure of the picture.
Yep. Moving on to this one. I mean, for me, I've never seen anything like this before. So immediately I was like, that's interesting. Is that like a lava flow? Like, how come there's these dead trees growing out of what looks like lava? It just looks really interesting. You have this awesome color contrast. You have red and then white, and then you have bare ground and then trees. And so like there's just a lot to explore and a lot to like.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a reasonably well-known location because I've seen photographs of these trees before.
Okay.
But yeah, and I think it's tufa. I think it's limestone deposits, or well, not limestone. Sorry, tufa deposits from a spring.
Oh, okay.
But it's the color variation in it between the reds and the whites. And the really well handled trees, the composition with the trees they're not overly contrasty. They sit nicely in that lighter area, the tufa. And in the red section of it, you've got these white lines dropping through it, almost like lightning coming down the picture. And perhaps the weakest part of the picture is the transition between the two, where you may have some iron oxide, rusty areas with the yellow. But there's lovely lighting.
I was going to say, I felt like it could have used a little bit more room on this side of the frame.
Agreed.
Just a little bit. But otherwise, it's fantastic. And I don't know if you noticed the little bird.
Yeah.
On the tree. It's kind of a nice touch. Okay. And then moving on to this one. So this is another one of those subjects that we saw a lot of submissions very similar to this. This would be one of the more interesting ones for sure, in terms of just how different it is. For me, I like the swirly tag patterns that are created with the water. You have all these swirls that kind of pull your eye from left to right through the frame. There's nothing in the way that keeps your eye from moving across. You have all of these interesting little bubble areas that are very interesting and add contrast to the dark black water. And I think, as far as black and white goes, it's very strong.
Yeah. I mean, the big thing for me here is that they've looked at some of the broad structures. So you got a spiral in the bottom left, and then you got this big wave going through the top right. But you can see that it's receded slightly because the patterns are getting smaller. So you've got this three-dimensionality from foreground to background. And then within each of these structures, you've got the way the blobs are working around them. So it's got broad structure and it's got detail between them. And I think that's well seen and well composed, especially as you say, with situations like these, they're quite fast moving. So it's very hard to set something up and play with it.
They picked a really nice shutter speed for this.
Yeah. Just a little bit of movement in the foreground, but a lot of structure in the background. There's a lot to like about that.
And then lastly, I mean, we also saw a lot of images like this. In fact, I think just yesterday I shared one on our social media account. Instead of logs, it was just reflected clouds in the water. But I think those kind of images work well because it plays on your imagination of this three-dimensionality of like, okay, there's a coastline of a lake or something, but then it's like a whole other scene beyond it that it captivates you.
This
And you have
actually did
a-
really well with the judges. Out of the 6 pictures, I think this is one of the higher ranking ones. And I think because there's a novelty factor there. But also it's quite cleverly composed because the trees in the foreground work so well. It's quite difficult to get a nice clear horizon. It looks like a horizon. It doesn't look like you're looking down on the trees.
Yes. And what I liked is the repeating.
You see a logged river like that.
I like the repeating patterns, like of how the log jams kind of look similar.
Yes, there's structure in there again, isn't there? It's not just a random pattern of logs.
Right. I think that's what you should definitely look for, is how can you look for patterns like that to help tell the story?
Because when you're there, you're looking at it, you might just see it
overly saturated. It's not, you don't see any technical flaws in terms, I mean, if anything, there's things that other competitions might downgrade you for, like, this bottom left corner is it's not that great. You got this area here that's but overall those aren't, it's not weak enough to take away from it.
And it's so interesting beyond that for what it is.
Yep. Well, awesome, Tim.
Yeah, I enjoyed that.
I feel like hopefully people got something out of this, and we'll do some more as we go. Obviously it takes us some time to pull these together, but I think hopefully people can get a better idea of kind of what we're looking for. It might be a good idea next time, maybe we can focus on more of a single genre, like maybe just look at grand landscapes, because I know that's something people have been struggling with.
Definitely.
And so, because I know Alex wants to see more grand landscapes. I want to see more grand landscapes. I think everyone wants to see more.
They're so good, aren't they?
I think, and I think the biggest problem is that it's much harder to find really good conditions in a grand landscape, and compose it well.
We have an essay about it in the book. It's worth having a look at. And in which case, if you haven't bought the book yet, do so.
That's right. Buy the book. We'll put a link in the notes.
Brilliant.
All right.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.